Shutter speed is a slightly archaic term, but it measures the amount of time that light hits the image sensor to form an image. In old cameras, like my trusty Nikon here, there's actually a physical shutter inside. So I'm going to pop the lens off again and then open the back of the camera. And this little rectangular area here is the shutter. And you will see when I press the shutter release that it pops open, and you'll be able to see through and see the white of my t-shirt on the other side. Okay. Let me slow that down so it'll stay open even a little bit longer. Now, in a motion picture camera, this happens very, very quickly, right? So I'm going to change the shutter speed. So here we have 1 second. You can see that the shutter stays open for 1 second, allowing light to pass through. This is half a second. This is 1/4 of a second. Notice how every time I'm cutting the speed in half. Here's 1/8 of a second. Here's 1/15 of a second. One-30th of a second. This would be the slowest exposure that works for video. Here's 1/60th of a second. This is the standard exposure for a video camera. I can go faster, but I don't think it's going to show up on the camera. This is 1/125th of a second. Here's 1/250th, 1/500th, 1/1000th, which is as fast as this little camera will go. Video cameras do not have a physical shutter. They just have an image sensor, but that image sensor samples the light coming in many times a second. So it acts like there's a shutter. So the term shutter speed is still used. 1/60th of a second is a very standard shutter speed for video and television. It can go much, much faster. It can go a little bit slower. If you move into film or if you move to another country, the number changes a little bit in terms of what is standard. But we're going to work with what we have here. So 1/60th is kind of the default shutter speed for most things moving forward. If you end up with a career in filmmaking and you find yourself on some high-end digital cinema cameras, you're going to learn that there's a different way to measure shutter speed. They call it shutter angle. We'll talk a little bit about shutter angle if you're here next year. Again, we'll have some cinematic cameras to play with, and I can show you the insanity that is shutter angle. For this class, we're going to stick with measuring shutter speed in terms of fractions of a second, which is the way all of the sane world does it. Common sense tells you that the slower the shutter speed, the brighter the picture is going to be. And the faster the shutter speed, the darker the picture is going to be, right? The longer that shutter is open, the more light can come through, the brighter the picture will end up being. Because we measure things in fractions of a second, sometimes it's confusing as to what faster and slower means, right? So 1/60th of a second is faster than 1/30th of a second. Even though it sounds like a bigger number, it's not. Likewise, 1/60th of a second is slower than 1/500th of a second. Even though it seems like 1/500th is a bigger number, it's not. It's actually a much, much smaller number. Right? So we get to play with fractions, which maybe you haven't done for a while. Starting with 1/60th of a second as the default exposure, you either multiply or divide by 2 to get to the next common shutter speed, right? So if we were to slow down from 1/60th of a second, the next step down would be 1/30th of a second, right? If we're going to speed up from a 60th, we jump from a 60th to a 1/20th of a second. If we're going to speed up one stop, again, as always, we're doubling or halving, so we're moving one stop at a time. So if we're going to go one stop faster from a 1/20th of a second, we'll go to a 2/50th of a second. Okay, it should have been 240, but we're going to round it up to 250 because it makes the math easier for the next few steps. From 1/250, we go to 1/500th. From 1/500th, we go to 1/1000th. From 1/1000th, we go to 1/2000th. From 1/2000th, we go to 1/4000th. And then from 1/4000th, we jump a little bit and we end up at 1/10,000th. These are the numbers that are used by our JVC cameras. If you work with a different camera, you might find that there are some subtle variations. They might choose a different place to start rounding numbers off, but they're going to be really close. It's always going to start, and again, for video in America, 1/60th of a second is always going to be the default, and then it's going to be multiply or divide by 2, moving out from there. You need to understand how shutter speed works, and you need to remember the numbers. Now, this is going to be easier than memorizing the f-stops, because all you have to do is remember 1/60th of a second. That's where everything starts, at least for the purposes of this class. You start with 1/60th, and you either multiply or divide by 2, and that will give you a one-stop movement in terms of your shutter speed. You can't go slower than 1/30th of a second. That's the largest number you can have, right? But from 1/30th to 1/60th, you just divide it in half. Divide it in half again, you get 1/120th. Divide it in half again, you get 1/240th, except we're going to round that one to 1/250th. Divide it in half again, you get 1/500th, and so on. So if you can multiply and divide your fractions by 2, you've got this covered. Now your aperture and your shutter speed work in conjunction. The aperture controls how much light comes through the lens. The shutter speed controls how long that light touches the image sensor. And again, there's not really a shutter in there, but it's easier to imagine it that way. So if everything looks good, your iris is set at something, your shutter speed is set at something, and the image looks perfect, if you make a change to one setting, you have to make an equal but opposite change to the other setting. Right? So if everything is perfect and you open the iris by 2 stops, suddenly your image is 2 stops overexposed. So what do you have to do to compensate? You have to make the shutter speed 2 stops faster. Right? So you're spending less time looking at that brighter image, and you can come out with the same overall brightness level. Let's try to do a few examples here. Let's take this video as an example. Right now, the camera is set to f5.6 at 1/60th of a second. This is a very normal exposure for an indoor, comfortably lit environment. But being the cruel instructor that I am, I'm going to tell you to close down one stop on the iris. So you're going to change from f5.6 to f8. You closed one stop down, which means the picture is now one stop too dark. How are you going to fix that? What you're going to have to do is make the shutter speed longer. So from 1/60th of a second, it needs to be twice as long. So if you double that, you end up at 1/30th of a second. So 5.6 at 1/60th is the same brightness as f8 at 1/30th of a second. You made the hole smaller, so you had to wait longer for all the light to come through. Let's do another example. Imagine you're outdoors shooting a football game. Your exposure is f16 at 1/60th of a second. You know that when you edit this, you're going to want to use some slow motion, and you seem to remember me telling you that a fast shutter speed is better for slow motion. So you decide to speed the shutter up by 3 stops. So from 1/60th of a second, you bump it up to 1/120th, 1/250th, 1/500th. You change your shutter speed to 1/500th of a second, which means the image is now 3 stops underexposed. How are you going to fix that? Well, that one's easy. All you have to do is open the iris by the same amount. So since you closed the shutter, you made the shutter 3 stops faster, you need to open the iris 3 stops. So opening 3 stops from f16 puts us at f5.6. So there you have it again. The original exposure, f16 at 1/60th of a second, is equivalent to f5.6 at 1/500th of a second. As that iris opens more and more, as more and more light comes through, you have to spend less and less time to get the image on the sensor. If your mind is starting to balk at this, go ahead and take a break and think it through. Right now, we're only playing with two variables. We're changing the iris and we're changing the shutter speed, but we've still got two variables to go. By the end of this lesson, you'll be playing with 4 variables to get the exposure the way you want it. So make sure you understand these. Make sure you understand the relationship. As the iris lets more light in, you have to compensate by making the shutter faster. As the iris lets less light in, you have to compensate by making the shutter slower. They dance together, right? This is a partnership. You can't change one without the other. I'm sorry, I broke into song there. All right, so go ahead and take a minute, wrap your brain around this, and then we will move on.